Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca Holmes. I'm a research associate in the Social Protection and Social Policy programme at ODI, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this webinar on the politics of gender and social protection. This webinar is organised by the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and the UK's Department for International Development. This is the second in a series of webinars organised on the theme of social protection and gender equality. And all of these webinars are available on the socialprotection.org platform. The first webinar, which was hosted a couple of weeks ago and is available online, provided a rich discussion on how social protection can advance gender equality. This was discussing the key design and implementation features of social protection programs to support and promote equality and empowerment. In this webinar today, we move away from a focus on the technical design aspects of gender responsive social protection to explore the reasons why social protection is or isn't gender responsive, and particularly focusing on the political economy reasons behind this. This is an area which has received less attention to date so far in the discussions around social protection and gender responsiveness, but is incredibly important to furthering the agenda for social protection and how it can support gender equality and women's empowerment. This webinar is also particularly timely given the increased international focus on gender and social protection. The 63rd UN Commission on the Status of Women is being held next week with the priority theme of social protection systems, access to public services, and sustainable infrastructure for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. In this context, we've organised this webinar today, and we have a great lineup of 3 panellists who were asked to reflect upon the following key questions. So one of the first questions is, what are the political economy drivers and barriers to promoting gender responsive social protection? Who are the key influencers of social protection policy? And are there different politics at play for various different actors, including the role of government, donors, NGO and grassroots civil society? In what way do the politics of gender responsive social protection differ with regard to the life cycle in terms of actors and interests focus on young children, adolescents, mothers or older people, older women in particular? And then how can the challenges be overcome to promote social protection which transforms women and girls' lives in a politically smart way? So we're very fortunate to have the following 3 panellists today, each bringing a different perspective on this topic. So our first panellist is Nicola Jones. Nicola, if you could put your webcam on. She is a Principal Research Fellow in the Gender and Social Inclusion Programme at ODI, and she's the Director of the Gender and Adolescent Global Evidence Programme, GAGE. Our second speaker is Laura Alfers. She's the Director of the Social Protection Programme of the Global Research Action Advocacy Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalising and Organising. And our third panellist is Limón. She is a founder of the programme on daycare centres for working women's children at the Ministry of Social Development in Mexico. Leah, if you could put your webcam on. She is also former Vice Minister of Human Rights at the Ministry of the Interior and former local and federal congresswoman in Mexico. We're absolutely delighted to have the 3 of them speaking today, and their full bios can be found on the website. In terms of the format for today's webinar, each speaker will talk for approximately 15 minutes, and after all the presentations have been completed, we'll have an opportunity for discussion. So please send in your questions by posting them in the chat box on your screen, and then I will be putting the questions to the panelists after their presentations. If you can, please also include your details in terms of your name, organisation and country, and that way we can ensure a balance of the questions that are posed. Please also continue the conversation on social media. So we're using hashtags and Twitter, so using the hashtag CSW63 and handles at ODIDev, and also follow our live coverage on hashtag SPORG webinar. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on the platform to view again. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first panelist, Nicola Jones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So next slide, please. What I'm going to start my talk with is with the question of why is a gendered political economy lens important? And I think I'd just like to start by making the point that at its most basic, gendered political lens involves, as Roberts and Whalen, 1998, have argued, an exploration of how households, markets, and states as gendered institutions are created and regulated, not least by socially constructed norms at the local, national, and international levels. So in the case of social protection, this is obviously critical, given how all three of these sites are intimately linked to the provision of social protection. Moreover, as Rebecca highlighted, the largely technocratic approach that has been pursued vis-a-vis social protection to date has had limited traction in terms of advancing a transformative agenda for gender equality and women and girls empowerment. When we had a meeting last year, and Rebecca reflected on the last decade since we had started research on gender and social protection at ODI with support from DFID and what was then AusAid, what we realized was that while there had been some progress over the last 10 years, it has in fact been very limited. So what this presentation is going to try to do is to advance an analytical framework that can hopefully help galvanize social action around a more politically savvy approach to social protection. Next slide, please. So our starting point for this framework, which we're also developing further into a forthcoming ODI working paper, is that the development of policy and program outcomes involves a process of bargaining between state and society actors and interactions between both formal and informal institutions. And we draw, as you'll see from the diagram on the slide, on Rosendorf's 3 I's political economy framework. And the 3 pillars of the framework are ideas, institutions, and interests. And the aim is to better understand the complex interplay between each of these factors and the ways in which they shape social protection, debates, and outcomes. So the first pillar, ideas, captures the diverse discourses which are used to advance particular forms of social protection. And arguments can range from the rights to social protection as embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals and the potential to promote empowerment and inclusion of socially disadvantaged groups, right through to discourses about investments in human capital and even charity models to help the poorest. Then the second pillar refers to institutions, so to the formal and informal rules which shape where and how social protection negotiations are carried out. And then the third refers to interests, which are about the possible gains or losses that stakeholders stand to make in supporting particular social protection debates. Next slide, please. So if we begin with the first of the 3 I's, ideas. Now, these are central to the way in which public policy discussions are framed and in turn really shape the parameters of social protection policies and programs. And Hickey and Bracking have highlighted that national social protection systems reflect a very diverse array of ideas about poverty and vulnerability and the underlying causes. Also, different ideas about the purpose of social protection and, very importantly, the role of the state and other actors in delivering social protection support. When we then add a gender lens to the mix, what we see is that ideas can play a particularly powerful role as they're embedded in complex sociocultural norms which surround our understandings of the family, what it means to provide care to the most vulnerable, and also in advancing social reproduction. So I think what's important here is to think about the examples that have been made famous by the work that Maxime Molyneux, for example, has done in Latin America around the early generation of cash transfer programs, where she argued that ideas around mothers in service of the state really curtailed the transformative potential of social protection programs compared to if there'd been a more rights-based framing. And what we also see is that even within the caregiver model of social protection that has really reinforced traditional gender roles, that there have been silences, for example, of caregivers of especially vulnerable household members. So, for example, family members with disabilities. And this is something that's been highlighted in the work that we and our partners in Gaza and the West Bank have undertaken with UNICEF Palestine, where we've highlighted that the care for family members with disabilities typically falls disproportionately on the burdens of on the back of individual women, and to some extent their daughters or the siblings of family members with a disability. Next slide, please. There are, however, a number of promising practices in terms of social protection framings where there's been a more progressive and gender-sensitive discourse used. And so I just want to highlight a couple of positive examples here. So the first are what are now called labeled cash transfers, which really aim at nudging people's behavior. So they're not conditional in the sense that if people don't comply with the conditions, they would be cut off from a cash transfer program, but they do encourage particular types of behaviors. So, for example, in the case of Ghana's LEAP cash transfer program, from the outset, it highlighted that families receiving the cash transfer should avoid involving their children in particularly exploitative forms of child labor, including domestic work, and similarly to avoid the risks of child trafficking, which obviously has a strong gendered dimension as well. And we see something similar also in the labeled cash transfer for education that UNICEF Jordan is rolling out, the Hajati program, where households are encouraged to send their children to school amongst refugee communities. And here there's strong messaging relating to avoiding, in particular, boys' involvement in child labor and girls' vulnerability to child marriage. A second good example is the work that's being funded by the EU's Enhancing Rights Program in Central America. And here there's a cash plus approach which has been adopted for forcibly displaced adolescents in the region, and is framed in terms of not just providing cash, but in providing quote unquote dignified child safe spaces for girls and boys to protect them from all forms of violence and abuse, including gender-based violence. And then the third example I'd also like to highlight is the expanded framing of public works and what the labor content of those public works programs look like. And so we see, for example, in Ethiopia's flagship Productive Safety Net program, that community labor has also been defined as investments in time-saving community infrastructure. So, for example, the construction of water points and fuel wood collection points within a community to reduce burdens, particularly on adolescent girls and young women's time. And similarly to invest some of that public works labor in supporting female household heads in ploughing land in a cultural context where ploughing is taboo for women. And then there's also a broader understanding of public works labor within the South African Rural Roads program, where women have been able to be supported through the program for the care that they're providing to family members afflicted by the HIV and AIDS crisis, but also to invest in training and skills building so as to advance their economic empowerment. So rather than just focusing on what is typically the case in public works, terracing or road construction, in some cases the discourse has allowed for a much broader understanding of what type of support could be provided, and with some real transformative potential. Next slide, please. So the second pillar in the framework refers to institutions. And here we use Mahoney and Talon's definition, which describes institutions as relatively enduring features of political and social life that structure behavior and cannot be changed easily or instantaneously. So these rules can be formal, for example, elections and party politics, the legislature, the constitution, and the judiciary, or they might also be informal and often less visible institutions. And here we can think about things like old boys networks, family provisions of social protection, clan provisioning, and in the Islamic world then the zakat, religious tithing tradition. So all of these sets of rules shape the opportunities or constraints for negotiating social protection policies and programs, and tend to be highly context specific. And then within that, gendered outcomes are linked to the ways in which gender norms and practices are embedded within these institutions, either explicitly or implicitly. And not surprisingly, there's a substantial body of literature that really highlights the deeply patriarchal nature of these institutions. And that's something we need to be very mindful of in developing strategies to negotiate more gender responsive social protection. Next slide, please. So in terms of promising practices here, we need to think about context-appropriate entry points for championing progressive and gender-responsive social protection. So, for example, evidence suggests that there's a positive relationship between women being elected to local representative and decision-making roles who then champion social policy issues. At the subnational level, it may be the case, analysts argue, that local elections are perceived as more direct opportunities to hold officials to account on social policy. And this indeed is borne out by the work that Sugiyama has undertaken around the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. Then there's also some evidence of constitutional reform processes providing spaces for gender responsive social protection reforms. So Kenya's recent experience of constitutional reform has involved women legislators who are working strategically across parties and in alliance with feminist organizations to advance a number of new policy and legal changes, including a review of labor laws to push for an increase in maternity leave under the Employment Act of 2007. Thirdly, we also have some evidence of stronger interagency cooperation between donors and government agencies, implementing large-scale social protection programs. And here, these working groups are providing some scope for gender mainstreaming. And here we would provide the examples of Rwanda's public works program and also Ethiopia's. And finally, there's some real potential in social audit approaches which promote beneficiary feedback loops to strengthen gender-sensitive targeting guidance and questions. So whether that's the Indian Public Works program, which has a social audit initiative, or work that CARE International has done in Egypt around community scorecards. Next slide, please. And then the final pillar within the framework is around interests. And really this is about the extent to which key actors are able to gain or lose from policy shifts. So whether that's in terms of resources, votes, professional reputation and delivery of mandates, and then also power imbalances between officials in different ministries. So here, what we have seen in the literature is that there's evidence of increased willingness and indeed urgency by elites to extend social assistance when there are legitimacy crises within governments. And Rwanda's failure to translate economic growth into more inclusive development is an example where we've seen the expansion of social protection programming. And similarly, in the case of Peru, the Juntos cash transfer program was initiated to promote greater social cohesion and redress a legacy of political violence during the civil war there. But unfortunately, what we do see is that there's really limited incentives for elites to push for gender-responsive social protection agendas. Next slide, please. And so I don't have time to go into this here, but we do see a few examples where executives or the legislative branch are advancing more gender-responsive social protection initiatives and even party elites, but they tend to be in the minority. I won't go into any of the civil society examples because we have two great examples that Laura and Leah will provide. So what I would like to do now is just to briefly wrap up and to think about what are some of the takeaway lessons in trying to think about how we can become more politically savvy in advancing gender responsive social protection. So the last slide, please. What I've tried to do here is to highlight 6 key recommendations for action. So the first is how critically important it is to map social protection and gender actors in each context, including their power relations, interests, discursive strategies. So to really identify strategic entry points when starting to push for new programming or program revisions. The second is that we also need to think about routinely embedding political economy expertise in program design and rollout teams. Thirdly, we need to invest in support for gender-focused civil society organizations so that they can become much more established voices in social protection dialogues, given their relative exclusion to date. Fourthly, it's really important also to invest in capacity building with program implementers to promote buy-in in terms of gender-responsive features. Too often there's a disconnect between program design and implementation because of dearth of capacity and understanding. Fifthly, we need to invest in documentation of not just technical, but also political negotiations underlying program design and implementation. That should be a critical and routine part of monitoring and evaluation processes, I would argue. And then finally, we need to make sure that program evaluations routinely adopt a gender and life cycle lens to identify gains in terms of these political negotiations, but also where the silences and the gaps are. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicola, for that excellent presentation. Really great to have that sort of framework of overview of political economy and also the action points and recommendations. Thank you. I'm going to swiftly hand over to our second presenter, Laura Alfers.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Can we have the next slide, please? My name is Laura Alfers, and I'm from an organization called WIEGO. And just to give a bit of background on WIEGO, we're a global network of membership-based organizations, what we call MBOs, of informal workers, researchers and development professionals working to improve the status of informal workers and particularly women informal workers. We work to provide support to these organizations of informal workers, to try and facilitate space for informal workers to represent themselves directly in policy processes, as well as doing research, policy analysis, and working to improve statistics in support of workers in the informal economy. So the examples that I'm going to be speaking about today are not examples from all over the world. They are examples that we've drawn from our network of membership-based organizations. Another sort of contextual point to bring up is that for women informal workers in particular, social services such as health, childcare, etc., are as important to protecting incomes as the more traditionally defined forms of social protection, insurances and assistance, cash grants, etc. So we take a very broad perspective on social protection, and for us the fact that services are considered together with insurances and assistance actually is the definition of gendered social protection. Next slide, please. So why do we think grassroots participation is important? Why do we spend so much time and energy working to support this? For one, we think that MBOs, grassroots membership-based organizations, working with themselves, but also in alliance with other civil society groups, can create strong social mobilization for gender-responsive social protection. It can make it much more difficult, for example, for governments to remove entitlements once they have been brought in, and it can also promote the provision of entitlements by creating a strong mobilization. A second reason is that we think it's important that governments and policymakers in particular, experts who might be sitting very far away from the ground, realize what it is about social protection schemes that will actually reach beneficiaries on the ground. And sometimes it's surprising what a maternity benefit that will actually reach informal workers might look like. And so to have the experience and voices of informal workers in the room is important. And I think a third thing is that informal worker organizations or workers organizations, grassroots organizations, there are examples where they have started to provide their own forms of social protection or their own services to their members. I think this is a tricky area, but I think one positive thing that happens is that it provides an example to governments and to wider society about what is possible. It provides a model. And I'm going to talk through these and give examples drawing on these as the presentation goes along. Next slide. So taking things up to a slightly higher level, looking at the sort of experiences of our members, what are the factors shaping their ability to participate in policy-making processes around social protection? And I think that two key areas sort of jump up immediately. The first is whether there is space for civil society engagement in the development of social protection policies. And there are more questions: why those spaces have opened up, who sets the terms of engagement, and what are the ideas that are setting these terms. I think some of the things that Nicola was talking about before me about what actually determines the nature of the spaces that exist. And I think the types of spaces that open up determines the strategies that grassroots organizations will use to influence policy in their own interests. I think a second key thing to think about is the internal politics of civil society itself. And I mean a broader civil society. Grassroots organizations are only one aspect of that. But whose voices matter within civil society? And how capacitated are grassroots organizations themselves to engage meaningfully in policy spaces? Next slide, please. So to go a bit deeper into the first of these issues, the spaces for civil society participation, and to give you some examples of strategies that grassroots organizations have used, but how they have also been shaped by the nature of the policy spaces. A very good example is that from one of our affiliates, HomeNet Thailand, who are a network of home-based workers in Thailand, mainly women, who worked together with civil society allies known as the 9 Network. There were grassroots organizations from 9 different areas of civil society coming together, who successfully launched a campaign and pushed for the implementation of the Universal Coverage Health Scheme in Thailand, which is a free public health service. There's no insurance, no contribution required. And what they did prior to this movement, there was a small contribution required of 30 baht. After this, the 30 baht was scrapped. And I think where we see here is a very open space for participation. there was an opening due to a hotly contested election in the early 2000s. Political parties saw the opportunity that this presented. There were also mechanisms for civil society to input into the policy processes. So there's a thing called the People's Law in Thailand, which allowed civil society to collect 50,000 signatures in support of their UC scheme. They drafted draft legislation, which wasn't actually adopted in the end, but did influence the final scheme, which was passed through Parliament. And I think what was really important was that they pushed for and won was that in the management of the scheme, there's been consistently spaces for civil society participation. So at every level of the UC scheme in Thailand, you will find civil society representation. And HomeNet Thailand at the moment sits on the National Health Security Board. So I think that's an example of a really open space that allowed a very expansive amount of influence from the worker organizations. A more limited example comes from Kenya, the Kenyan Association of Street Vendors and Informal Traders, with the extension of the Kenyan National Hospital Insurance Fund in Kenya to incorporate contributions from self-employed informal workers. The NHIF were under pressure to expand membership into the informal economy. And this created some space for CNASFIT. It wasn't a totally open process. There was no necessarily scope for CNASFIT to have influenced right from the beginning. But the need for the National Hospital Insurance Fund to expand did create some opening. And CNASFIT then offered to help with the collection of membership contributions, to integrate education into their monthly meetings, to use those monthly meetings as points for contributions to be collected, and to really facilitate the membership of their members into the scheme, and in return receiving extra benefits from the National Hospital Insurance Fund. But ultimately that fell away when the National Hospital Insurance Fund increased the premiums, and CNASFIT's members really struggled to pay with that. So much less space for participation, but some ability to make demands on the hospital insurance fund that they change the way that contributions are made. So instead of being monthly, it could be every 3 months when CNASFIT holds its meetings, and so on and so forth. I think another very interesting example is when we see political space as very limited or even non-existent. And this is where you typically see organizations providing their own services to members, both as a practical strategy to get services to their members, but also as an influencing and awareness raising strategy. So the Asmari Waste Picker Cooperative in Brazil found a real need to support their members with childcare services. They developed their own childcare service, and later it became politically possible that for Brazil to implement childcare services through the state. The cooperative's childcare service was integrated into the national system of daycare centres, and it's a particularly interesting one because it was very well suited to the time needs of waste pickers. We also see this with the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. The Lok Swasthya Sewa Mandali is the health cooperative, their network of community healthcare workers, providing all sorts of preventive and basic healthcare to members. This started at a time where it was just not a thing in India that these kind of services would be provided through the public system. But in a way, it has influenced the Indian government. There is now a network of ASHAs, who are community health workers who provide sexual and reproductive health support to the grassroots. And SEWA has sort of stepped back a bit from that and is now looking at providing support in other areas, occupational health and safety, non-communicable diseases. Again, moving away from where the state has moved in to fill the space and moving into areas where the state doesn't exist yet, and hopefully pushing the state to think about these things in the future. Next slide, please. So on to the second point, which is about the internal politics of civil society and about whose voices count and how much spaces organizations are given to represent themselves. I mean, I think this is where it's really interesting. It's also probably why informal worker organizations have tended to have more influence around social services than they have in terms of social security. The tripartite, the spaces around social security are very dominated by the sort of tripartite government, formal labor, and the state. Even informal worker organizations, even if they are affiliated to a trade union, cannot be directly represented in those spaces. What you'll often find is that the representative from formal labor will be expected to speak for both formal and informal workers. And I think there's some advantage to this. It creates a space for informal workers, but because their interests are not always the same, it can mean that informal worker interests, and I think particularly women informal worker interests, can be marginalized. I think in terms of social assistance, I think that there isn't much space for informal workers to speak as workers in these spaces because they're not targeted by most social assistance schemes at the moment. They tend to target people outside of the labour market. It's also a space that I feel is dominated by NGOs, which are very different from membership-based organisations. I think NGOs can do a lot to support membership-based organisations, but they're not the same thing. And it's a space where there's a lot of experts running around, and I think that does marginalize grassroots voices and does sort of put them into a niche of somebody will hear from about their lived experiences, but isn't necessarily going to be the person, you know, talking about how we form this policy. I think thirdly, in terms of gender, the gendered politics of informal worker organizations is also a problem. We recently ran a workshop in Zambia last year through the Rights-Based Social Protection Project, which is a collaboration with FES Zambia. And it was very interesting to see how men and women, how women workers, informal workers within their own organizations struggled to get their concerns taken seriously by the leaders of the organizations. And I'm talking particularly here of maternity benefits and childcare. Next slide. I think a big issue, and it's the one related to the sort of how much space is taken up by experts and academics and NGOs, is this issue of how much capacity grassroots organizations have to engage on social protection. Social protection can be a highly technical issue. And I think there is a question about how equipped grassroots organizations are to be able to contribute meaningfully. I think that there is starting to be some really interesting examples of capacity building support aimed at governments and perhaps the sort of higher tier of civil society. But I don't think that is reaching grassroots organizations. And if we are to create a demand, which I think is important because the demand is what creates the struggle, which creates the policies and the interests of society, we really have to think in social protection circles about how we start developing a pedagogy around social protection that is going to reach the grassroots. Next slide. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. I just wanted to end with a picture from the International Domestic Workers Federation Congress, which was held in South Africa in 2018. And part of our work over the next 2 years is going to be with the IBWF on social protection and thinking about where and how social protection can feed into their organizing and advocacy strategies, and really how we can start to envisage social protection as a tool for movement building, as a tool which can help facilitate worker organizations and engagements with the state. Thank you.
Great, Laura. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. That was a really good insight into the grassroots participation, into the spaces of social protection and gender responsiveness, but also sort of what are the strategies that are used and the spaces that are created, as well as some good points forward as well. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, Leah Limón.
Okay. Am I? Yeah. Hold on. Can you see me?
We can. Thank you, Leah.
Yeah, they can. Okay. Good morning. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to this space to present this policy that has been operating over the last 12 years in Mexico and that has been taken away by the new government. I'm going to talk about the federal daycare programming, daycare centers programming for working mothers. This program was launched in Mexico in 2007, spearheaded by the President Felipe Calderón. Actually, I was in charge of the operation of the program, of the implementation and operation of the program during the first years. This was a program in which individual women were provided with cash grants to renovate and equip homes or facilitate to operate as safe daycare centers. These women were also trained, and they also present some different exams to be able to start with a daycare center. And they have been trained also over the 12 years to become better prepared for taking care of the children. Subsidies were given to the child care centers for low-income working mothers, and later we also included single fathers for children under the age of 4 years old. These subsidies were around $50 a month for each mother, and mothers pay the rest of the let's say of the scholarship of their children. So it was like these centers were like a mixed model between the scholarship that they get from the government, the grant that they get from the government, and the other part, complementary responsibility, we used to call it, that the mothers used to pay. By 2012, these daycare centers, which we used to call them estancias infantiles, were providing care for over 330,000 urban children. I have to say that this was the federal government that attended more children comparing to other models. Actually, this model was attending 100,000 more children than the one that it's for people with social security, because this model is mainly for women that has not social security. But this model is being attending more than 100,000 more mothers, more children than the model that the social security institutions have. This model, we can say, that was attending 50% of the children that are attended by the federal government by different models that have been implemented all over the country. However, the new administration in Mexico effectively closing down the program as of 2019, they decided to end the program, to stop the operation of the program, and to take away the support to the 9,565 daycare centers that were operating in more than 1,200 municipalities and attending, as I said, 330,000 children in the country. They decided to close down the program, and the mode of delivery has been changed to what has been said here, to a direct cash transfer to mothers that they can spend in whatever they want, but not necessarily in the daycare centers. This change in approach has met with first opposition by everyone, not just by women civil society organizations and NGOs, but also by different federal agencies, by the National Commission on Human Rights, by the National System on Childhood Protection, by the Center for the Evaluation of of Social Policies, and by obviously all the organizations, all the opposition in the Congress, and basically by everyone. I want also to explain that despite of the approval of the Congress of a budget for the operation of the program, which was approved in December 2018, they decided to basically disappear the program. The government argue that they find irregularities in the program without proving any of the irregularities. Actually, the office that is in charge of auditing, the control office that is in charge of auditing all the programs, said that they just find observations in 1.8% of the budget of the program, which is nothing. And that they just found some observations in 300 of the daycare centers out of 9,565. So this argue of finding irregularities hasn't been a good explanation for this decision of taking away the program. I want also to say that they announced a new program, which is a program called Program of Well-being of Children from Working Mothers. And there are 5 differences that I want to mention that in the new program that they are promoting. First, the new program, it's only focused in indigenous and in very high poverty municipalities, which means it's only focused in 625 municipalities and just in 17 states of the country out of 32. The program that we used to have was focused in the whole country. It has presence in 1,294 municipalities, which represent 53% of the municipalities of the country. And the new focalization that they are promoting in the new program of direct transfers take away the support to all the women that live in poverty conditions that are from urban poverty, that live in urban poverty conditions, which are the women that mainly work in the informal sector. So this is something that is really bad. They also lower the support, and the support that are going to be given are not directed to the attendance of the daycare centers. Women can use this support in whatever they want without proving that they are using it for the daycare centers. And on the other hand, the only last point that I want to mention is that we used to have very strict supervision measures for the daycare centers, and they are not taking into account these measures. They are not taking responsibility of the operation of the centers. They are not taking responsibility of how they are going to function. They are not guaranteeing the mothers that the place in which they take their children is a safe place anymore. They say they are not going to take care of the center of how the centers work. They're just giving direct transfers without taking care of these spaces, putting into risk the children that attend there. So basically, these new direct transfers, which are fine. I mean, I'm happy that they are announcing direct transfers to women, but these transfers cannot substitute a program that has been working for 12 years and that has been successfully implementing, attending more than 2 million children during these 12 years of operation. Mothers have been saying that they will not have any safe places to take their children while they go to work. And I have to say that every one out of 4 families in Mexico are headed by women. So headed by women, I mean they are lonely women that they take care of their whole family in every term, not just in economic terms, but in taking care of the children. And the participation of women in the labor market has enormously increased in the late decade. And also, I have to say that in the informal sector is where there is much more increase of the woman participation. These women have not social security. They have not any other way of guaranteeing secure places to take their children while they are working. And the end of this program is not just putting into risk all these children and violating their rights, but also violating the right of all these women, all these mothers, to be able to combine professional development and work with family and with the right of being a mother. We are actually doing all what we can, not just arguing against this decision, but also taking legally measures. We started and we will have more habeas corpus promoted by the beneficiaries of this program. And we are also trying to raise the voice in the international area and arena to ask for help and intervention for changing this very unfair decision. And also the decision will affect more than 60,000 women that are being employed in these centers. So we are very worried about this decision. We are trying to change what has been decided, and we are completely convinced in civil society and the opposition parties and in all the institutions that I have mentioned that the decision that the government made, it's a wrong decision that will affect the security of the children and will make mothers abandon some of them. I mean, actually, it has been said by the organization in charge of evaluating social programs that 34% of the women that are beneficiaries of this program have already said that they will have to abandon their job if this program is closed. And this program, according to those evaluations, has allowed 70% of the women that didn't have a work when they get into the program to find a work and to raise their income in favor of their children, of their family, and of themselves. So that's what I can say. Evaluations of this program has proved that the program has an important impact on the integration of women to the labor market. Taking away this program, it will affect the integration and the rights of children and of women in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Leah, thank you very much for that presentation. That was incredibly interesting, but also difficult to hear the kind of challenges that you're facing at the moment. But thank you for providing us with that insight and also an understanding of what you're trying to do collectively to address these challenges. So we're going to move on to a question and answer. So we've got about 10-15 minutes. We have had a few questions through already, which is great. So I'm going to ask those questions now. There's actually one for each speaker. So first to Nicola, there's a question regarding the EU-funded cash transfer in Central America. Could more details be provided and which countries were involved? Laura, a question to you. Someone who's writing, who worked on a study for the World Bank, which looked at the role of MBOs in Nigeria as a vehicle to target services at informal women workers. They said that they found substantial barriers to women getting involved, such as membership fees and requirements, as well as the exclusion of younger or unmarried women. And the question is whether you have found these types of barriers and have you had success in persuading MBOs to change these policies? And thirdly, a question for you, Leah, on the Mexican case. The question is if the closure of the program is more due to political rather than technical reasons. And a question about whether the program was focused on poor families and whether it was implemented in rural areas. So if each of you were able to respond to that, and then we'll see if we have time for another round of questions. Nicola, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Bex. And thank you for the question. So the Enhancing Rights and Protection Programme funded by the EU is taking place with young people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. It aims to provide cash plus the Safe Spaces initiative that I mentioned, but there's also a systems strengthening component, which is aiming to improve the linkages between child protection systems at community, national, and regional or cross-border levels. And I think that's a very good example of a move towards cash plus initiatives, which are starting to try and frame vulnerabilities in a broader, more holistic way, which is so critical, particularly in the context of humanitarian crises. So just to give you very briefly contrast, so as part of the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program, we've been doing work with internally displaced communities in Ethiopia, and there the vulnerabilities of young people have been framed purely around basic needs such as shelter and food assistance, even though the adolescents that we've been talking to highlighted repeatedly what was most problematic for them in many cases was the inability to have any support services to deal with the trauma associated with very high levels of sexual and gender-based violence during that conflict in late 2017, early 2018 between the Oromia and Somalia regional states. So just I think a really important point about trying to frame vulnerabilities in a more holistic but also more gender responsive way is critical. Where this seems to be working well is the work that UNICEF Jordan has been doing with Syrian refugee populations. And our work there is highlighting that the linkages between the Hajati education cash transfer program that I mentioned, and then an integrated child and adolescent program, the Makani centers, is helping to reframe adolescent and young people's vulnerabilities in humanitarian contexts in a much broader way. So the Makani centers are offering not just safe spaces, but also support in terms of communication and negotiation skills, how to negotiate with families around pressures related to child marriage, for example, critical thinking and decision-making skills. And that this is, seen as particularly critical by the young people and particularly adolescent girls that we've been talking to in helping them negotiate a way forward or to have greater resilience in a context where so much has been disrupted in their lives. I think a very positive example of a broader framing, which is both life cycle and gender responsive.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicola, for that response. Laura, if I could ask you to respond to the question around the challenges of women being included into MBOs in particular.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a tough one, actually. And I wish we had somebody from our organization and representation program here who would probably have an answer that's much more direct and satisfying. I can give a few reflections about working with MBOs in relation to the question. I mean, I think we have to understand that not all MBOs are the same. They're different types of MBOs, just like there are different types of trade unions and different types of various types of organizations. Some are progressive, some are not progressive. Some are more akin to mafias. And I think that all groups, though, I mean, one of the things is that all groups and organizations tend to have rules of membership. And obviously, it would be better to have rules of membership that are more open and accommodating of vulnerable groups. But it's not always the case. At WIEGO, I mean, we can never dictate how organizations form. That's not part of our mandate. The mandate is to work with already formed organizations, but we do prefer and strongly encourage democratic practices within the organizations that we do work with. So collective decisions about how the rules of the organization are made. And our organization and representation program spends a lot of time working with MBOs to establish these kinds of promote these kinds of practices. I think that the question of membership contributions is interesting to me because many of WIEGO's members do have the rule that contributions must be made to be within the group. It shows a commitment to the organization. I think that collective decisions are made about how much that is going to be, and you know what level those contributions are set at. But it is the case that many of these organizations see that contribution as kind of vital to their operations, particularly if they are doing things like providing services to their members. I think the second reflection is that this highlights the role of class, which I think is something that we don't, especially in relation to the informal economy, and the intersections of class and gender in particular, that, you know, there's often an assumption that the informal economy is this sort of homogenous space, you know, extending social protection to the informal economy. But actually there are huge divisions within the informal economy, and often running along gender, race, class lines. And different groups within the informal economy might organize differently. I mean, it is true that what we find is that the most poor and the most vulnerable workers are the ones who are least likely to be organized. It is the sort of slightly better off members of the informal economy who are more likely to be organized, and that really is a big challenge to think about how you facilitate organization within in that context. But I also think that it is important for different groups within the informal economy to have their own organizations. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have, you know, headload porters organizing amongst themselves who are much poorer, much more less likely to be organized in a place like Accra in Ghana. That they are able to articulate and be in a group that allows them a different space from, say, market traders who are their employers most of the time. And I think that they should be able to set the rules of their group membership as well. The trick then is how you kind of get collaboration across these different groups in the interests of pushing for social protection that would benefit everybody. One really interesting example I can think of in respect to this is actually in Accra in Ghana, where there is an MBO, the Ghana Association of Market Traders, which is an alliance of the sort of top tier of market traders or women in Accra, over 40 markets, and very much the wholesaler employer type of informal worker, the better off group of women workers in the informal economy. And they had pushed hard for a childcare centre to be built in Nicola Market, in the centre of Nicola Market, and partly because they were concerned that the headload porters who were working for them didn't have childcare facilities. So I think that is an example of where there's been some kind of cross-class alliance between different groups in the informal economy to push for better service provision. And the people who benefit from this childcare service are overwhelmingly the headload porters, who often the market traders are subsidizing their access to this childcare centre. So it's not a direct answer to the question, because I think it's quite a complicated question, and it really very much depends on the context. But I do think that organizations do have their rules about, you know, who is and who isn't allowed in, and if those decisions have been made democratically and collectively, I think it's very hard to challenge those. What the trick then would be is to think about, well, how do you establish organization in the people who are being left out?
Great, thank you very much, Laura, for that response. And finally, just over to you, Leah, to answer the final question briefly, because we need to wrap up in just a few minutes.
Okay, yeah. First, to the question that if this decision of the government was more based on political reasons rather than technical reasons. Yes, it is. Let me explain a couple of things. First, the new government is disappearing all the social programs, all the public policies, and converting them into direct transfers. They actually take away the support to, this is something very bad what I'm going to say. They take away, they decided to take away the support to the refugees for women that have been suffering violence. Those spaces where women run and look for when they are being where they have been hit in their homes, and when their life is in risk, and run away from their houses, getting into these refugees. The president has decided to take away the support to these refugees, which is very bad. He also decided to take away the support to all NGOs in Mexico, including obviously all those that work with women, gender, and with children. And he decided to take away, saying that he doesn't want anyone playing a role in the middle between himself or the government and the people. So he decided to give all direct transfers. His argument, it's corruption. And this is a very bad decision, because although you can find cases of corruption, you have to sanction those cases without affecting the whole. As I said, for example, he's arguing corruption in the program of daycare centers, where the observation of the audit office is just to 300 centers. What we have been saying is that he should sanction those cases. He can even close those 300 centers, but keep going with the other 9,265 centers that attend all those children. So this decision of taking away all the support to everyone and just doing direct transfers, in my opinion, is more a decision related to building clientelism and a sector of the population to guarantee electoral votes than to guarantee human rights and equality and safety of the children. It's, in my opinion, all these usually direct transfers that have been implemented in many countries don't guarantee that people move away from poverty. They just build or help the government to build a clientelistic way to operate without guaranteeing that people's rights are safe. I have also to say that when they decided first to reduce the budget of the program, because that was the first decision, in the 1st of December, when this government took place, he announced that he was going to continue with these daycare centers. Then he cut the budget to half of what they used to have. And when people complain, when the responsibles of the daycare centers complain, and many of all complain, he came out to say that he was eliminating the program because the program was a political program. It's a very strange decision, because this program is a program that has been operating during 12 years, although with different governments coming from different parties. I mean, it started in 2007 with Felipe Calderón from the PAN, and then it continued in 2012 with Enrique Peña Nieto from the PRI. So it's not a program of a political party. It's a public policy that benefits working women and that benefits children. And yeah, I think that there is a lot of political reason for this decision. And then to the question of if this program applies in rural areas, yes, this program applies, as I said, in half of the municipalities of the country, more than half. It applies obviously more in urban areas than rural areas because those are the mothers that need it more. But it also applies in rural areas. It also applies in indigenous areas, in municipalities where it's the first time in life that there is a daycare center, and it applies, and with the very good examples of daycare centers that have been working for 12 years, making a huge change with those children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leah. Sorry to cut you a little bit short, and thank you everybody for staying a few minutes later. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for your incredibly interesting and insightful presentations. Thank you also to the audience for your great questions. Just a quick note that there will be the next webinar in this series on the topic of financing gender responsive social protection, and that is likely to be held on the 11th of April, so do keep your eyes out for that. Also, ODI will be at the CSW 63 next week. If you're interested in coming to any of the sessions that we're organising, please do check out our events page, which is on odi.org/events. But thank you very much, everybody, and it's been a great pleasure organising and hearing on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.